sounded forth the trumpet that shall never call retreat. He is sifting out the hearts of men before his judgment seat. Oh, be swift, my soul, to answer him. Be jubilant, my feet. Our God is marching on. Glory, glory, hallelujah. Glory, glory, hallelujah. Glory, glory, hallelujah. Our God is marching on. Glory, glory, hallelujah. Our God is marching on. Thine eyes have seen the glory of the coming of the Lord. He is trampling out the vintage where the grapes of wrath are stored.
All right, welcome to Christian Overcomers, and thank you for joining us for this live Bible study. Hey, we're going to do part 4 in our series on the end times, and we're going to title this one, The Great Signs of 33 to 70 AD. And before we get into this, I do want to say if you got a question or a comment and you want to give us a call, you can call us at 612-819-3910, or else you can leave a comment in the live chat box, and we'll try to address those as we go as well. We'd love to hear from you. Other than that, last week we kind of touched on the significance of the temple being destroyed in 70 AD, and that really cannot be understated. I mean, the temple being destroyed in 70 AD in Matthew 24 was the climax of all of the signs that Jesus gave in Matthew chapter 24. It was interesting, while the Roman general Titus was removing that temple stone by stone, the temple that was in Jerusalem, God was actually building a spiritual temple stone by stone. And Peter talks about that in 1 Peter chapter 2. He says we are as living stones built up as a spiritual house or a spiritual temple. And that's where we offer sacrifices to God now in the spiritual sense. So we saw a big change. We went from this physical temple all of a sudden to the spiritual temple at officially, I guess you could say, in 70 AD when that temple was demolished. So I guess, let me see where we're going to go here. I guess what we're going to talk about here today is in Matthew chapter 24, Jesus gave many of the signs that would come to pass before or leading up to the destruction of the temple in 70 AD. He said there would be false Christs, false prophets, wars and rumors of wars, famines, pestilences, earthquakes, martyrdoms, great tribulation. The gospel would be preached to the entire world. The powers of the heavens would be shaken, signs in heaven, etc. There are a lot of different signs that Jesus said that they would see, marking the finality or the end of that age. So today we're going to discuss how many of these signs that I just read that are mentioned in Matthew 24, we're going to go through and try to break apart each one. We won't get through all of them, but we're going to take a look at some of them, primarily how they were actually fulfilled in the Bible itself. I mean, there were false prophets mentioned in the Bible between the years 33 AD and 70 AD. There were earthquakes, there were famines, and all those things actually recorded in the Bible, so you don't even have to just go to secular history to find out that, yes, the disciples or the apostles were seeing these signs that Jesus spoke of in Matthew chapter 24. So that's where we will be primarily, but you can find the history of this, a lot of history of these signs being fulfilled in the book of Josephus, a Jewish historian, as well as in a lot of other writings around that era. I think even a lot of the writings of the Jews themselves. So let's go to, actually, Damien, do you have any questions on anything before we get started or comments?
Well, no, other than I'm just fascinated by this whole study, and I think there's probably other people out there that are like me, that these facts that you're pulling out of the Bible here are stuff that I was never taught. I never read on my own. Well, I read it on my own, but I would just kind of gloss over them, and so this is, like, to me, like, in a good way, earth-shattering information. You know, it's blowing my mind biblically, if you will.
Yeah, when you find out that a lot of the things that Jesus said, if not all of them, in Matthew 24 actually came to pass, some people say, well, that kind of takes away from the excitement of what we're supposed to see. We're not saying that everything's been fulfilled in the Bible or all prophecy has been, but the things in Matthew 24 have been fulfilled, with the temple being destroyed and so forth. But what it does is it actually documents that what Jesus said was true and it came to pass. Whereas the skeptic could say, well, none of these things, these things are never going to happen, that Jesus said. But now we can go back to the skeptic knowing that, yes, they did come to pass. You could show him, you could say, look, Jesus said this was going to happen before he was crucified. And, within 40 years, within that 40-year generation, these things came to pass exactly as he said they would come to pass.
And I think that some people that have been following us and what you're teaching think that you're saying that all prophecy has been fulfilled. And that's not at all what you're saying.
Yeah.
You're saying that a lot of it that we thought was pertaining to us in the end times has actually been fulfilled. But you're not saying all has been fulfilled in any way, shape, or form. But I think, just from things that people I've talked to and things I've read, I think that some people are taking it that way.
Okay.
That you're saying that all prophecies have been fulfilled. So what's the point? What are we here for? And in fact, the caller that last Wednesday kind of said the same thing, that that if that's the case, then what are we, but I don't feel like you're saying that when you listen to what you're really saying, you're not saying that. So if people are confused.
I'm in the process of trying to figure out exactly what has been fulfilled and what hasn't. So this is, again, I'm not, when you talk about preterism versus futurism, right, and amillennialism, premillennialism, postmillennialism, and all those types of things, I don't have a solid stance on any of those, and I don't know if I will ever completely align with any of those particular ones. So right now I'm just trying to stay fluid and let the Bible show us the facts without, jumping on one and saying I really like that one, I like that view, so I'm going to then try to make everything fit into that view.
Right.
We should probably do a quick sound check here. You want to pull that up real quick? I just want to make sure people can hear us. We got sound? Okay, good. All right.
It's important.
Yeah, we forgot. I was going to check the sound and I never did, but we're good. All right. So let's go, unless you got anything else, maybe we'll start with the false Christs.
Get into it.
That were prophesied to come before the destruction of Jerusalem in 70 AD. Why don't we go to Luke 21, verse 8 in our Bibles. If you got your Bible, please get it out and follow along with us. We're going to be going through a number of scriptures here about these signs. All right, so Luke 21, verse 8, Jesus said, take heed that you be not deceived, for many shall come in my name, saying, I am Christ, and the time draweth near, go ye not after them. So that's what we're going to look at. Jesus said that many people would say, I am Christ, or I am the Messiah, and people would follow them. And Jesus said, don't follow them. So if we go to Acts chapter 8, we're going to find out there's Now, there were many more false messiahs mentioned in the book of Josephus. He said there's all kinds of them, because the Jews were expecting the Messiah still. They rejected Christ. So they kept looking for a Messiah that was going to deliver them from the Romans. And so anybody that looked as though they were a strong military leader and had some gifts or powers from God, they were like, yeah, this is awesome, let's go do it, And one of them is actually mentioned in Acts chapter 8. If I can find it here. Here we go. Acts chapter 8. Well, I think I'm just going to pick up on verse 1. And Saul was consenting unto his death, unto Stephen here. And at that time there was now check this out. And at that time there was a great persecution against the church which was at Jerusalem. Now, remember, that was one of the things that Jesus said would come to pass in Matthew 24. He said, the disciples said, hey, what are we going to see before, what kind of signs are we going to see that'll mark the end of this age and the destruction of the temple? One of the things Jesus said was, you're going to be hated of all men for my name's sake. You're going to be persecuted. And some of you are going to be killed. Well, this is what happened. I mean, right here we read, not just historically, but biblically and historically, it's in the Bible, that there was a great persecution against the church in Jerusalem in this 8th chapter of the book of Acts. I don't have the date here. I wish I would have figured that out, but this is obviously somewhere between 33 AD and 70 AD. And then it says, and they were scattered abroad throughout the regions of Judea and Samaria, except the apostles. So the persecution was so great in Jerusalem at this time that almost all the regular Christians, so to speak, the Christian converts, left Jerusalem except for the apostles. They stayed there to keep preaching the message because I think probably because Jesus said you're going to be delivered up to kings and rulers and you're going to give a testimony against them. And so because that's who he said would specifically be going in front of these kings and rulers were the apostles. Now, I'm not sure if any other Christian converts after that were delivered up to kings and rulers of Rome or not for a testimony. We know a lot of them were martyred and things like that later on. But and then it says, and devout men carried Stephen to his burial and made great lamentation over him. As for Saul, he made havoc of the church, entering into every house and hailing men and women, committed to them to the prison. So here we go. The Apostle Paul, who was Saul before, actually partook in this great persecution of the church. Therefore, they that were scattered abroad went everywhere preaching the word. Let me see here. We're going to get to this false prophet. Here we go. Verse 9. We'll skip down to verse 9 of Acts chapter 8, this false Christ here. And there was a certain man called Simon, which beforetime in the same city used sorcery and bewitched the people of Samaria, giving out that himself was some great one. I don't know if he said he was the Messiah or if he was just a great prophet. To whom they gave heed from the least to the greatest, saying, this man is the great power of God. So this Simon was one of those people that Jesus warned the disciples of. He said, don't follow these guys, because it's not me. It's not me. I didn't give these guys power. Don't go into the wilderness with them and think that there's going to be some great miraculous thing happen out there, or deliverance from the Romans or something like that.
And he was doing like magic and stuff too.
Yeah.
Apparently.
Yeah. Jesus actually said that there would be false prophets that would be able to show signs and wonders to seduce, if it were possible, even the elect, even the most dedicated Christians. And this guy appeared to have done that. It says all gave heed to this guy, from the least even to the greatest. They all thought this guy was somebody special. This is just because this came to pass, though. doesn't mean that these types of characters don't come, that we don't have these types of characters today. We have those.
For sure.
So it says, and to him they had regard because of a long time he had bewitched them with sorceries. So there we see that's how he bewitched these people. That's how he deceived them, was through sorcery.
Well, and you see, I mean, it was definitely a prophecy that fulfilled there, but and I think a lot of them probably do have double meaning. But you see people nowadays. I don't know if you watch any of the televised Christian channels, but there's guys that claim to be healers, and they can, change your life, and they can get you riches, and they can heal cancer, and they can do all these amazing things.
Yeah.
And I don't know. I'm a little skeptical of them, but they seem to make a lot of money doing it. So.
Yeah, and I think that's why. I think if we kept reading, I think that was one of the things that Simon was, this false prophet or false Messiah or whatever he was. He was all about making money or buying the power of the Holy Spirit.
Right.
And so I guess if we skip over to Acts chapter 21, let me see here what verse we're going to pick up at. I forgot to write down the specific verse, so I just got to scroll through here and find this next character here. Acts 21. Oh, here it is. Acts 21, verse 37. And Paul was to be led into the castle. And as Paul was to be led into the castle, he said unto the chief captain. Now here's Paul. Here's another example. Paul was being brought up before the rulers and the kings. And, one of the things that Jesus said that his disciples or his apostles would have as a gift or some divine power was that they would God would give them a mouth speaking wisdom, such great wisdom that even their adversaries could not resist. And Paul did that many times while he was speaking to the Romans. He just had the right words at the right time. He knew how to. I think at one time he divided the Pharisees and the Sadducees against was it the Pharisees and Sadducees? Yeah, I think it was the Pharisees and the Sadducees against each other, because Paul said he was a Pharisee. So God actually helped give him the right words at the right time. But here it says, Paul was led unto the chief captain, and he says, "May I speak unto thee?" Who said, Canst thou speak Greek? Art thou not that Egyptian? This is the Roman authority here. He says, Are you not that Egyptian, which before these days made an uproar, and leddest out into the wilderness 4,000 men that were murderers? So here was a false Messiah that this Roman official is asking Paul, are you that false Messiah that led 4,000 people out in the wilderness, to probably try to revolt against the Romans? And Paul's going to say, no, I'm not that guy. But the reason why we went there is that's another example of where Christ's words of Matthew 24 were fulfilled, not just historically, but you can actually find cases of it in the Bible. But Paul said, I am not that man. Paul said, I am a man which am a Jew of Tarsus, a city in Cilicia, a citizen of no mean city. I beseech thee, suffer me to speak unto the people, and so forth. All right, so he was not that man. And then we go to 2 Corinthians chapter 11. And we'll pick it up in verse 12. 2 Corinthians 11, verse 12. He says, But what I do, that I will do, that I may cut off occasion from them which desire occasion, that wherein they glory they may be found even as we. For such are false apostles, deceitful workers, transforming themselves into the apostles of Christ. And then he says, and no marvel, for Satan himself is transformed into an angel of light. Therefore, it is no great thing that if his ministers also be transformed as the ministers of righteousness, and then so on and so forth. But here Paul says he's referring to a whole bunch of people living in his time as false apostles. That, again, that fulfills, at least in part, that's one of the signs that Jesus said that the apostles would see. And they were evidently dealing with these guys that were trying to pull people away from the church, pull people away from the gospel into something else. You got anything you want to say?
Yeah, I think it's definitely, it seems, it makes sense that after Christ came and claimed to be the Messiah, and then he died and was resurrected, but I don't think a lot of people knew or believed that he actually was resurrected. So everybody's mind and their mentality and their thoughts were on this Messiah that was coming. So I can see why, just like any big fad or anything that happens, people catch on to it and they try to take advantage of it. And so I could see from the point of Jesus coming and all the impact he made to the point they died, he started a movement of people that wanted to be like him or wanted to have that same power, that same ability to change and move people.
Yeah, you're right. Yeah, there was a messianic fervor, if you would.
Yeah, there you go.
In Jerusalem at that time, and to add to what you're saying there, a lot of people were expecting the Messiah still to come. Even the ones that rejected Christ were still looking for the Messiah, because in Daniel chapter 9, there was the thing called the 77 prophecy, or 77's prophecy, or the 490-year prophecy. And they knew they were at the end of that 490 years, and the Messiah was supposed to come within that time. So they were, any guy that looked like he was fulfilling that role, they were quick to follow.
Right.
And that's another topic, actually, we're going to get into in this series of studies, is the 490 years of Daniel chapter 9. What I've discovered, and I want to go into it, dedicate at least one or two studies to it, is that, now think about this for a minute. The premillennialists, of which I've been, and I'm currently examining those beliefs right now, they separate off the last 7 years of that 490-year prophecy, and they say there's a big gap now. So there's been a gap of like 2,000 years, and then some people say when the Jews become a nation or something like that again, that time starts again, the last 7 years starts, or that'll be the 7 years of the Antichrist or whatever. But when you carefully look at that timeline, first of all, a timeline is not a timeline if there's a big gap in it. I mean, it'd be like what do you call it? Daniel the prophet. If he was, he was praying before he was given the 77's prophecy, or the 490 years, he was praying about the 70-year captivity being over. Now imagine if God put a 2,000-year gap in the 70-year captivity, the Israelites, would have been 2,070 years in captivity. So it is my belief, after doing a bunch of research on it, that those 490 years were complete with Christ bringing in the new covenant, and that and the destruction of Jerusalem is actually mentioned in that 490-year prophecy. It talks about the desolations and of the city of Jerusalem and so forth. I'm not going to get into the specifics of it now, but that was a topic, and I even taught a study few years ago explaining why I thought there was a gap. And when looking back at it now, I have to admit it was sort of a stretch. I think I knew that if there was a gap, there had to have been a scripture that would say there's a gap. And I quoted, Revelation chapter 7 when the four winds were about to blow and the four winds were told to stop until the servants were sealed. And I thought, well, if there's a gap, that's got to be the verse that says there's a gap. But that's looking back at it now and seeing what the end of that prophecy really was about was Jesus making an end of sins and bringing in a spiritual kingdom upon this earth. And it didn't mean that that was the end of the world, the 490-year prophecy. It just meant that was an end. That was the end of the old covenant age. So that's the big thing that we're looking at. There's a difference there. Now, we could be coming up towards the end of this age that we're living in our own end times, but it's not necessarily, or we can't force it to fit the end times of that age. And it's hard for us sometimes, many of us have been taught by different teachers and have had our mindset by them in these gap theories and all these other things that make their whole premillennial system work. So it is, it's one thing I've learned over the years of studying is when you gotta really start adding gaps and changing what the meanings are of things, the plain meanings of the scriptures, then maybe you're not understanding it right, and you've got to come up with a new template, if you would, of how things are going down. But anyways, so I didn't mean to get off on that, the 490 years, but we will get into that. And it's fascinating that Jesus' ministry was actually, at least half of that period of that last 7, was he taught for exactly, I believe, 3.5 years. And that would be one half of that final heptad, or that final 7. All right, so back to our signs here. But one of the reasons I brought that up is because that 490 years ties in specifically with the fall of Jerusalem in 70 AD as well. All right, so we are going to 2 Timothy chapter 2, verse 16. I'll pick up on 15. Paul says to Timothy, "Study to show thyself approved unto God, a workman that needeth not to be ashamed." Now check this out. "Rightly dividing the word of truth. But shun profane and vain babblings, for they will increase unto more ungodliness." Now here's what we came here for. "And their word will eat as doth a canker," like a cankerworm, "of whom is Hymenaeus and is that Philetus? I'll go with Philetus. So verse 18, he says, "Who concerning the truth have erred, saying that the resurrection is past already, and overthrow the faith of some." So it appears as though these guys were saying that the final resurrection of both the living and the dead already came to pass, and it was confusing people at this time. But here's an example of other false apostles, false prophets, false teachers that they were dealing with. All right. I'm going to go to page 85. Now, this book is a very interesting book. I didn't put a link to it. Maybe I'll try to put one in the video description later. I don't necessarily agree with everything the writer talks about.
I like the title.
Yeah, End Times, or Last Days Madness, right? It's the author is Gary DeMar, and he goes in and he covers Matthew 24 in depth, similar to how we've been covering it here, but in a lot more detail. And I'm going to read from page 85 of his book, and let me see here. I thought it was page 85. False prophets. All right. Let me see. All right, I guess I'll go over here. It's actually page 84. I wrote it down wrong. But anyways, the Apostle Peter writes that false prophets also arose among the people, just as there will be false teachers among you who will secretly introduce destructive heresies, even denying the master that brought them, bringing upon themselves swift destruction. These false prophets, okay, I don't think that's it. I don't think that's it as well either. But let me see here. Well, I thought this was going to give me some history of some false prophets, and I just wrote down the wrong page number. So maybe I'll try to find that for another study for you guys, and we'll get into it. That was a big failure there, but I apologize. But what do you do?
Happens to the best of us.
All right, so we'll move on to famines. That was another sign that Jesus said would come to pass. And before I do that, I'm going to just quickly look at and see if we got any comments going on here so far. Let me see. Sandra Long says, Paul is a false apostle. Today, church, follow Paul over Jesus. You know, I had people, interesting that you said that you say that. It was because of people, even some friends of mine, trying to tell me that Paul was a false apostle, that actually caused me to really awaken to the new covenant. And it's because Paul taught the new covenant better than, I shouldn't say better than anyone else, but he really taught it well. And God used him for that purpose. So I would say you're just not understanding Paul over Jesus, because Paul and Jesus were teaching the same thing. You know, Paul in the book of Galatians actually nails down specifically what the gospel is. He was continually fighting the Judaizers, the legalists, you name it. Paul was definitely not a false apostle. Sandra, I'm saying this out of love, but you really got to read his writings closely and compare them with the teachings of Christ, because they mesh together like this. And I am so thankful that God sent the Apostle Paul, because it's totally changed my outlook. You know, before reading the Apostle Paul, I sort of view myself as a Christian still trying to halfway live under the old covenant. You can't do that. You can't do that and be pleasing to God. You got to be all in the new covenant. Otherwise, you're like what Paul says, a Judaizer. You know, you end up taking away from Christ. Any doctrine, any gospel that doesn't have Jesus as the center, and whether it puffs up some fleshly seed line or something like that, that's taken away from Christ. Anything and everything we have is in Christ. That's what the gospel is about. So here's Christ at the center. If anybody's teaching something that makes you go this way, that way, or whatever, it's leading you astray. And Paul puts you right to Christ.
I wonder what she means by today, the modern church follows Paul over Jesus. I know like there's certain churches that put a lot of weight on Mary, but I haven't personally observed that. Obviously she has, but
I think where she's coming from, she says in her next question, what about the holy feast days of God being overlooked and doing pagan holidays? We can't blame that on Paul. I don't know where we'd get that. We blame it on Paul. Now he talks a lot about how we're not justified by the law. You know, think about it. The feast days. When the temple was destroyed in 70 AD, those feast days, the law commanded that they came to Jerusalem for those feast days. Jesus said they will no longer worship me in spirit and in truth. To that woman, I can't remember. It was that John. I can't remember what chapter it was now. But he said they're no longer going to come to Jerusalem to worship me. Or in the Zion, they're going to worship the Father in spirit and in truth. Now, there could be a case made there. Well, Jesus fulfilled many of the things that the feast days symbolized, right. But also you can't, without Jerusalem, there really is no feast day. So think about that. A lot of things changed from the old covenant to the new covenant. And Sandra, I thought along the same lines as you, not about Paul being a false apostle, but about the feast days and all that. And I kind of put a lot of emphasis on those at one time, and it just, that's another thing where you start trying to live like a Jew, basically, and we don't have to do that anymore now that Christ has come. The pagan holidays is an issue. I will agree with you there that we got Santa Claus and we got Easter bunnies and all that, but that can't be thrown on the Apostle Paul. He wouldn't have taught that. Let me see here. Anyways, Sandra Long says, has Revelations already been fulfilled? Well, when you look at the book of Revelation, and we did a study on it, go check out our part 1 of the end times. There are so many statements in the beginning of the book, in the middle of the book, and at the end of the book where Jesus said, all these things are going to shortly come to pass. I'm coming quickly. The time is at hand, or it's an arm's length away. Well, an arm's length away is